How does a 27-year-old director whose only filmmaking experience comes from TV commercials, industrial workplace training videos, and short segments on shows like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood go on to create the most successful horror subgenre of all time, inspiring beloved horror media like The Walking Dead, World War Z, and Resident Evil by creating what we know today as the zombie? Let's talk about it. Hi, my name is Montgomery and welcome to Bloody Good. Today we're going to be talking about the man who created the zombie and why Hollywood wanted nothing to do with him. George A. Romero was born on February 4th, 1940 and grew up in New York City. From an early age he was obsessed with watching movies and would frequently rent movies from the city and take them back home. A film that had a profound effect on him was The Tale of Hoffman. The film wasn't that popular at the rental store George frequented. In fact, it was only him and one other customer who would regularly rent it out. That customer was Martin Scorsese. At 14, George began his filmmaking journey, borrowing a Super 8 camcorder from his uncle. He began with his first film, The Man from the Meteor, in which the climax of the film involved the man from the meteor being shot with his own ray gun, bursting into flames and falling from the top of a building. Even from an early age, George was a filmmaker who loved practical effects, so when the script called for a burning body to fall from a building, he did just that, lighting a dummy on fire and throwing it off. This scared residents, obviously, and ended up with the police being called and arresting George, causing his parents to come pick him up from the station. Now, it was during this time George came across one of his biggest inspirations for horror for the rest of his career. But, unlike zombies, this threat felt very, very real. As overblown as it could be seen today, the Red Scare was an all-too-real threat for a young George A. Romero. George lived through citywide blackouts and school bomb drills, but what truly haunted him was a short propaganda cartoon depicting the effects of an atom bomb landing on an American city. While attending Suffield Academy in Connecticut, Romero made two 8mm shorts, Gorilla and Earth Bottom. The latter was a geology documentary that won him a Future Scientist of America award. Now, with some recognition and awards under his belt, he set his sights on going to university, picking a university in Pittsburgh, where he studied art and theatre design. It was here he would meet some of his lifelong collaborators. While attending university, George got his first experience working on set, working as either a page boy or a grip, depending on different sources and, to be honest, different interviews George gave over the years. It was here he got his first big break, working on Alfred Hitchcock's North by Northwest. George said later on he wasn't a fan of Alfred Hitchcock's directing style, calling it mechanical and passionless. After dropping out of university at 23 years old, George A. Romero and his longtime collaborators, Russ Streiner and Richard Ritchie, went on to continue to make more films. George went as far to borrow $5,000 to purchase a Bolex camera from the very same uncle who lent him his 8mm camera for his very first short film. The plan was to make 3 separate short films combined together into one feature film called Expostulations. Unfortunately, this is now considered lost media. Well, it was until recently. One of the films was recently found. The single surviving film, Romero's Elegy, is currently under restoration by the George A. Romero Foundation. After making a number of short films, George wanted to be serious and pursue this filmmaking career full-time. He got together with a couple of friends and they formed the production company Leighton Image, where they would make commercials and mini-documentaries. Romero's first gig was shooting several segments for a TV show being shot at Pittsburgh in the time. And that show was...
It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood.
Yes, that's right. One of the earliest directing gigs the father of horror ever got was on one of the most wholesome TV shows to ever exist. Now, fast forward a few years and Leighton Image is doing good. Hell, it's even profitable. But George has this itch scratching at him. He got in this to make movies, not commercials and documentaries. So, him and his friends decided one day they were going to do just that. They were going to make their very own movie. They formed Image 10 Production. The company aspired to make a feature film. With a budget of $114,000, George called back to an early inspiration, I Am Legend, a book about societal upheaval, where flesh-eating vampires roam the streets and one man is left to survive, alone in a desolate, harsh, unforgiving world. So George began writing a script, working with a John Russo, and when they finished the script, they had their film, The Night of Anubis. Yeah, they'll change that, don't worry, we'll get to that. Thanks to the small film industry of Pittsburgh and George A. Romero's stellar reputation with not just crew but actors and studios, he was able to get locations, crew members, and actors for relatively cheap. Everyone was very excited to work with George, and they made the film in between shooting beer commercials. Everything was coming together. Well, almost. A young special effects makeup artist that George had previously met, a man going by the name of Tom Savini, was slated to work on the film, doing the gore and makeup effects for the flesh-eating ghouls. Unfortunately, Tom had been drafted into Vietnam as a war photographer and was unable to work on the film. But don't worry, we'll come back to Tom later. The film was shot between June and November 1967, and filming was relatively smooth. The film had its name changed from Night of Anubis to Night of the Flesh Eaters. Yeah, I promise we'll get there. We'll get it right soon. On October 1968, the film was released, and its total box office gross was $30 million internationally, making it one of the most successful independent films of all time. However, they did make one small change. The distribution company didn't like the name Night of the Flesh Eaters and wanted to change it. So they changed it to Night of the Living Dead. Finally got there. However, this would prove to be one of George A. Romero's biggest regrets. When the editor responsible for changing the title did so, they forgot one thing: to add the copyright notice onto the new version. Without this, the film entered public domain, meaning after the initial release, any company that could get a hold of a print was free to sell and distribute the film wherever they please, costing George A. Romero greatly. However, in the long run, this wasn't all bad. With the film not being copyrighted, it meant the film reached a far larger audience than it ever would have if it kept its original copyright. When the film was released, critics hit back at it, calling it grisly and unnecessarily gory. So with a popular film being distributed as his first directorial debut, you would think Hollywood would be banging on the door, wanting George A. Romero to do the next blockbuster horror. Well, yes and no. Off the back of Night of the Living Dead, George A. Romero went on to direct 4 other films, 3 of which flopped at the box office, and the 4th being critically acclaimed but still far from the hit Night of the Living Dead was. Instead of jetting off to Hollywood, George decided to stay in Pittsburgh, and it was when he was seeing a friend who was opening the first mall in western Pennsylvania, the Monroeville Mall, he had an idea. I went out to visit before it opened and saw trucks coming in, bringing everything that you could ever possibly want in your life into this enormous building. So the concept was there, it just seemed like a temple to consumerism. This inspired George to start writing his next script, with themes of consumerism and excess. He decided this would be the perfect setting for another zombie story, and all he needed was the right team. This is where he got the call from Dario Argento, an Italian film producer he had previously been introduced to. And when learning he was working on another zombie film, Argento wanted in. He invited George to come live with him in Rome while he wrote the script. In 3.5 weeks, the script was done. George's wife at the time, Christine, kept insisting he was writing it too big, involving helicopters, gunfights, and biker gangs. As George began putting together a list of people to work with, at the top of his list was Tom Savini. He sent him the script and told him, start thinking of ways to kill people. The majority of the film was shot at night to compensate for the schedule of the mall's opening and closing hours. The film even went as far to take a break over the holiday period due to the time it would take to not only take down the Christmas decorations for filming, but put them back up again whilst they were done. The bikers in the film were another problem George had to tackle, but George was smart and resourceful. For the main roles of the bikers, he hired actual actors with some motorcycle riding experience. For the rest of them, he hired the Pagans, a real-life biker group. Now, the Pagans were mostly well-behaved, thanks in part to them having their very own wrangler on set to keep them under control. This didn't stop them from occasionally trying to steal fake weapons from the film to use for other activities. The film kept to its scrappy roots that George was used to, with Tom Savini and his brother having a background in gymnastics and doing the majority of the stunt work. One of these stunts left Tom Savini temporarily unable to walk, forcing him to use a golf cart to get around set while shooting. The film had 3 major different theatrical cuts. The first being the major film release, the second being the Cannes Film Festival cuts, and the third being the Argento cut, made by the producer Argento himself. For the European release, it included a different soundtrack and had a much more serious tone, a couple less pies in the face. While the film had success in Europe, they struggled to find distribution in the US once again, with distributors wanting to make significant changes to clean it up. Once again, Hollywood had turned their nose up to George, but George and his team trusted the film had legs. It was producer Richard P. Rubinstein, a very successful producer now, who came up with the idea of taking out an ad in the local newspaper. The crew and cast showed up to the premiere and saw lines going around the block. The film was a hit, and it was in that very cinema Richard P. Rubinstein secured funding for distribution. With an estimated budget of $650,000, the film earned over $55 million worldwide. So George had once again made a worldwide hit, so surely this was his golden ticket to Hollywood. Well, yes and no. The distribution company George had signed with a free picture deal, with the caveat that one of those films had to be a sequel to Dawn of the Dead. Now, George was hesitant to rush into another zombie film, so the first film was The Night Riders, which was a box office and critical bomb. The second film, Creepshow, a collaboration between George and Stephen King, proved much more successful, but now the clock had run out, and George was responsible for fulfilling his end of the deal by starting work on a sequel to Dawn of the Dead. In 1984, George was looking around and seeing the world turn on itself. George began working on the script and had a great idea for a barricaded city full of survivors that was surrounded by zombies. Which may sound familiar, but we'll get to that shortly. However, the ideas George had far exceeded the budget, with Tom Savini referring to it as Raiders of the Lost Ark with zombies.
It took me a while to sort of get there in my head and to come up with this whole idea of, people not getting along and, the military being the crazy one.
The film was shot without incident, bar a couple small things, such as pig guts that were used for gore in the film were stored in a fridge that was accidentally turned off. Now, without time to get new pig guts, they had to use these rotten pig guts that had been sitting in a fridge for days. This caused the zombie actors to get physically ill while shooting the scene and lead to probably some of the best zombie acting we've ever seen. As the film got ready to be released, George found the advertising campaign to be uninspired and not very creative, relying too heavily on his previous films and his name to really carry the weight of the film. As well as confusing trailers, another big hit for the film was Return of the Living Dead, releasing the same year, causing confusion between fans and critics about which film was George A. Romero's. When the film finally did receive a limited release, critical and fan reception was mixed. Critics often called the acting hammy and over the top, and fans didn't like the tone where it was more serious than the previous Dawn of the Dead. With a budget of $3.5 million, its total domestic gross was $5 million. By no means a flop, but not the success compared to Dawn of the Dead. Hollywood took this as a message. George A. Romero was not a profitable director. Years went by, and in the 90s it seemed the zombie movie had taken its final blow, and George kept himself busy with various movies. But in the background, something was happening. In the 2000s, much like the zombie itself, the zombie genre began to rise from the dead. With hits like Zombieland, 28 Days Later, and Shaun of the Dead, a plague had began spreading, and zombie fever began to sweep the population. George had already begun writing a fourth installment to his Of the Dead series, called Dead Reckoning. That's going to change, don't worry. He was able to secure funding thanks to Universal Pictures securing a $15 million budget, the highest budget of the franchise, with the film finally being retitled to Land of the Dead. Now, even with a higher budget, like all things in filmmaking, problems still arose. First and foremost was the elements. With the film being shot in Canada, there was a race to shoot its external shots before snow touched the ground, meaning the first few days of shooting included scenes with hundreds of extras wearing full prosthetics and missing limbs. Greg Nicotero, the special effects makeup supervisor for the film, and is a horror legend in his own right, talks about it more.
You know, and we are always the first ones here and the last ones to leave. So you figure 4.5 hours before call and 2 hours cleaning up after call. You know, we were consistently working 18-hour days. I've learned a lot of really intriguing things on this movie. One was that I can exist on 3 hours of sleep a night, which I never thought I would ever be able to do.
The film was released in 2005 and had a mixed receptions from both critics and fans. However, financially, this was their second most successful film in the franchise yet, grossing a global $47 million. With the modern box office success that had long eluded George A. Romero, a follow-up film was sure to be in the works, and with zombie fever hitting a boiling point, that film came quick. In 2006, George announced his latest work on a film, Diary of the Dead. The days of waiting a decade to even decades between films in the franchise was gone, and George was on fire. George actually had the idea of Diary of the Dead whilst in the middle of making Land of the Dead, saying in an interview, "I wanted to do something about emerging media. I thought, well, that's a way to get back and do something really inexpensive and simple, and see if I still have the chops and stamina to go make another little guerrilla movie and relate back to the original thing." George also saw this as a way to reset his universe, with the film following a group of college students on the first couple days of the outbreak. The film was a pain to shoot. Using multiple cameras and often shooting in a 360 degree of vision, it meant actors and crew members often had to duck underneath cameras as they were spinning around. George talks about how scenes were choreographed almost like a dance. The film released in 2007 to mixed critical and fan response, and on a modest budget of $2 million made back $5 million, still turning a profit. This kept George going at an insane rate, making his next film Survival of the Dead, a film that follows a group of National Guardsmen who were first seen in Diary of the Dead. The film shows them leaving America to go to a small island just off the coast, where two Irish families are in a decade-long feud. The film has Western themes and follows zombies as they become more and more intelligent, with one even riding a horse. Yep. The film raised a budget of $4 million, but made back around $143,000 upon release in 2009. Even though the film aimed to explore the humanity and evolution of zombies, critical and fan reception was almost universally negative. However, when speaking about making the film, George had this to say: "I'm just having fun. I've had a long career, including several years where my partner and I were out in Hollywood in development hell, and made a lot of money, but never made any movies, and got really frustrated with that. I moved to Canada and started working with people. I love to work, and I'm just having a ball." Even with the film's less than stellar reception, George was just having fun, and when asked about future films in an interview, he had this to say: "I'd love to. I don't know, man. Maybe I have 3 or 4 films in me. I don't know, so I have to pick my shot." That shot unfortunately never came. On July 16th, 2017, George A. Romero passed away in his sleep after a short battle with lung cancer at the age of 77. Now, George left a final treatment for one last film called Twilight of the Dead, which had plans to be shooting in March of this year, which obviously did not happen. The latest news about the film came from an interview with Greg Nicotero on Slash Radio back in October of this year, who mentioned they are still waiting for them to secure financing. George A. Romero was not only a legendary filmmaker who created a whole new monster that took over both the fictional world and the real one. He was a filmmaker who lifted up others, often hiring unknown actors and giving them their first big break. I think the best way to summarize the kind of filmmaker and really man George A. Romero was in this interview he did with Drew Reba when speaking about having to compromise his vision on Day of the Dead due to budget constraints. Everybody says to me, "Oh, what a fucking tragedy." I said, "No, man, I gotta make a movie." You know, it wasn't a tragedy. I kept the soul of the piece. I kept exactly what the theme of it was. All I had to do was cut out a boat chase and all the bullshit that probably would have been just bullshit anyways. If you have your eye on what the soul of the piece is, and if you know what you're trying to say, and if you know what your theme is, man, you can do that with 2 people in a room. Thank you so much for watching. We really appreciate you giving us your time to entertain you. We really do appreciate that. And if you want to be entertained a bit more and you like George A. Romero stuff, we've made quite a few videos on his work, honestly, so feel free to check those out. And before you go, we do have some news. We have sold out officially. Thanks to all the attention, we've been able to monetize the channel, so thank you. And we've also launched a membership program. Now, don't worry, nothing is being changed. If you're viewing the channel for free, that is fine. No issue with that. This just means it's like bonus stuff, emojis, extra polls, helping us figure out what the next video is, and, you know, giving us your input. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, please consider it, but no pressure. Times are tough right now. Trust me, we get that especially. So thank you for even just considering it. And if not, thank you for watching. We really appreciate it.